That's a good thing. As we move on towards Pesach, we start to think about Eliyahu Hanavi, maybe the most important biblical character who actually appears and has a marquee role in Passover, in the celebration. In the traditional Haggadah, Moses does not appear. His name does not appear. In some places, there's a little bit of cutting and pasting, a little bit of surgery on a biblical verse in order to get his name in. But mainly, the collective judgment of the sages who built the Haggadah, who cut and pasted it from all of their sources, was to leave Moses out of the Haggadah. It is not really a story about Moses, it's a story about God and God's relationship with God's people. And to tell a story about Moses invites a kind of occultic attitude towards Moses of which the rabbis are not fond. Elijah, on the other hand, is of this world and also not. He is from this side of the doorway, as it were, and also not. He is able to look underneath or behind the curtain and to transmit or to somehow present or represent that which is known on one side to that which is known on the other side. So Moses, the liminal character, which is to say he appears on the threshold. He is both on this side of the door and on the other. Elijah, did I say Moses? Elijah, yeah, Elijah is the character whom we invite instead. It's also the case that Moses, who is the one who splits the water the first time, is replaced by Elijah, who splits the water at the end of his life. He splits the water of the Jordan River, striking it with his cape, and he and his disciple Elisha walk across the water. And then when Elijah is taken up by a chariot of fire, he drops his cape, his mantle with which he struck the water, and then Elisha strikes the water and comes across again on dry land, replacing now, in the eyes of the 50 people from Beit El who are witnessing this extraordinary moment, he replaces Elijah as the prophet of the day. So when the dust clears, there are 4 water splitters in the Bible, 2 masters and 2 disciples. The masters are Moses and Elijah, and the disciples are Joshua, who splits the Jordan, and Elisha, who splits the Jordan River as well. But Moses is carried deeply into the Seder, not because of that. Indeed, that's not really mentioned on his account, but because of the doorway.
Elijah.
Excuse me. Yeah, Elijah. But because of the doorway, the place where he stands, protecting the inside or sanctifying the inside and protecting us from the outside, we could say. This has had different meanings in different centuries as people have dared to open their doors on the night of Passover in communities that were largely hostile to them. So relying on Elijah for all of these things, many of which have to do with the doorway, is a sign of Pesach and of hospitality on Pesach. And there are a lot of stories about Elijah, and we started reading them, I guess, last time. Reading about Elijah going from the entrance, from the doorway of the cave to the doorway of the city of Rome, and finding meaning and finding Mashiach, finding the Messiah, sitting by the gates of Rome in this extraordinary story, and hearing a third voice, which perhaps Elijah interprets for him and explains to him why it is that you think you hear or you do hear a resonance of a third voice. What we have in front of us in just a couple of minutes is another story about Elijah and doorways and voices, as it happens. Elijah and doorways and voices. Perhaps we can read it. Let's do that. Who's in charge? Oh,
Rachel.
Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel.
Okay, we're going to go right to the English and see if we can make it larger enough for most folks to read it. Is that for you? Can we each do it?
I think so. Is that big enough for you?
It's big enough for me. I also have a paper. Oh, well, that's wild.
Size.
Got it?
Yeah, how's the size?
Size is good.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Rabbi Yossi said, once I was traveling and I entered one of the ruins of Jerusalem to pray. Elijah, Zachur Latov, always remembered for the good, came and waited for me at the entrance until I had finished my prayer. After I finished my prayer, he said to me, Shalom Alecha, peace be upon you, my master. I answered, Shalom Alecha, my master and my teacher. Reminiscent of the greeting between Elijah and the Messiah in the last story, actually. He said to me, my son, why did you enter this ruin? To pray, I replied. Said Elijah, you should have prayed on the road. I was afraid, said I, lest the passersby interrupt me. He said to me, you should have prayed a shortened prayer. And so I learned three things from him. I learned that one does not enter a ruin. I learned that one prays on the road. And I learned that one who prays on the road prays a shortened prayer. And what do you think thus far? What does this look like to you? How are you making the movie? What's the staging of it? Does Rabbi Yossi actually see Elijah waiting for him? Does he recognize that it's Elijah? Does he merely hear somebody behind him or see a shadow projected against the wall at his side, a shadow that might look a lot like Alfred Hitchcock for all we know? Jane. You're muted.
Since Elijah knows things before people know them, why didn't Elijah stop him from going into the ruin to pray? He just stands there and lets him do it, even though it's against the rules.
Apparently so. Yeah.
But he doesn't stop him. He waits for him to finish the prayer.
Right. Right. That's his. Yes, Adina.
Where is Elijah? Is he there in the ruins?
He's in the ruins.
Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
Where he shouldn't
But
be.
but he's I don't know, maybe he's come in behind, maybe he's following around, he's following Rabbi Yossi.
He's there, yeah.
Yeah, Rabbi Yossi lives at the end of the 1st century. Jerusalem is probably still smoldering embers. Those big, huge limestone blocks burn very slowly and pop out of the walls of Jerusalem with a kind of viciousness, and things keep falling. And Jerusalem has been laid waste and is not really re-inhabited. And this story is preceded by an halachic discussion about whether or not you should stop to daven in such a place. Should you stop to pray in such a place as that? Those places that are perhaps homes to bandits, to drug dealers, to wild critters.
So it seems to me that all of these are very practical suggestions. Don't be in a ruin where somebody might find you, or a part of the ruin might fall on your head. You should pray on the road because you don't want to wait. You don't want to falter. You don't want to have an excuse that you didn't get a chance for the prayer. But if you happen to be on the road, make it short because it's not safe there either. So these all seem very practical, whereas sometimes the advice is more esoteric. This seems very practical today.
Errol has his hand up.
Yes, Errol,
You're muted.
unmute yourself.
Okay,
There you go.
essentially, he's saying you should have prayed in public. You went into the ruins to avoid praying in public. But if you're praying on the road, then you're praying in public, and you should have done that.
You shouldn't have done that. You should have pulled.
You should have done.
Oh, you should have done that.
You should have done the public prayer, even though it's shorter than the private one.
You should have pulled off into the rest area or off to the side of the road if it was urgent that you say the Shema within the next 20 minutes or whatever it might be. But you should have prayed in public, even though you risk being interrupted by somebody who stops to ask you where King's Dominion is or whether you have a gas can they can borrow. It won't matter. But you should pray in public rather than go into the ruin. And yet Rabbi Yossi, who probably is at the center of this debate, he at least knows about this debate. He's one of the great sages in the Beit Midrash in his day. He chooses to go into a ruin. And he walks into the ruin and he says to us, I entered into a ruin at one of the ruins of Jerusalem to pray, parentheses, yes, I know I shouldn't have, according to the rules. Elijah came and waited for me in the ruins. And he waited for me ad shesiyamti et tfilati, until I finished my prayer. Now, again, in my movie version, he doesn't see Elijah. He knows Elijah. He knows that somebody is back there. And he knows that whoever is back there, maybe he sees enough of a shadow or a garment or catches a glimpse of somebody in his peripheral vision. He identifies it, if not as Elijah, then at least somebody dressed like a sage and who has the derech eretz to wait for him to finish. So he knows something about what Rabbi Yossi is doing, and he doesn't storm in on him. And maybe as Rabbi Yossi trying to pray and concentrate on his prayer and also sift through all these possibilities and clues, maybe he realizes that it is Eliyahu. Of course, it's Eliyahu. And if it's not, it ought to be.
Well, he addresses him as my master and my teacher.
Yes, he does. He does.
And also as my son.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that was Elijah addressing him as my son. Yeah. Afterwards.
Yeah. He said to me, you should have prayed a shortened prayer. And so I learned three things. You should have prayed on the road. I was afraid, he said, lest the passersby interrupt me. He said to him, you should have prayed a shortened prayer. And so I learned three things from him. I learned that one does not enter a ruin. I learned that one prays on the road. And I learned that one who prays on the road prays a shortened prayer. These are all the things that were products of the Beit Midrash. And yet Rabbi Yossi seems to prefer having learned them from experience, from the experience of encountering Elijah rather than from having read them in the 4th edition of the textbook, you know?
Which reminds me of my first flight to Israel, when half the plane got up and went to the back of the plane to pray. This is the modern road to Jerusalem.
Uh-huh.
And I don't think they did a shortened prayer.
Halfway across the ocean, they're just finishing. Yeah. That's interesting. I remember those days too. So is he rebuking? Do you think this is a gentle rebuke? Is he yelling? Elijah, the biblical Elijah is quite capable of muscle. He's quite capable of anger. And Diane says, or is Elijah defending, ready to defend Rabbi Yossi. Rhoda. You're muted.
I was thinking he's also telling him not to be perfect, because to go into the ruins, to be careful, is to be by yourself and to be able to do it just the way you want to make it as perfect as possible. But to be in public, to be possibly interrupted, all that means you don't have control of it. And so it's not going to be perfect. Things are going to happen, but he's saying it's better not to be perfect. It's better to take these, to do these other things. And that is better. And that's in a way being part of the world. It's not to sequester yourself.
Yeah.
That's what hit me.
Yeah, thank you. To actually make yourself part of the world, minimize the risk to yourself, even if it means compromising on the perfection of what
Yeah.
you thought you were going to find. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Elijah teaches him, instructs him, perhaps rebukes him, maybe sternly, maybe not sternly, but clearly. And now he says, my son, well, excuse me. Yeah, my son, what sound did you hear in that ruin? He asks him yet another question. I told him I heard a heavenly voice cooing like a dove and saying, woe to the children on account of whose sins I destroyed my house and burned my temple and exiled them among the nations. Oh my,
Yeah.
what a thing to hear. My son, Elijah continued, what sounds did you hear in that ruin? I told him I heard a heavenly voice cooing like a dove and saying, woe to the children on account of whose sins I destroyed my house and burned my temple and exiled them from among the nations. What a thing to hear God say. What impression does that make on you, that God would be saying these things? Did God foreordain this?
It's almost an apology.
Mhm.
It's almost an apology.
Lamenting what he did or
Right.
what happened.
What's
Elazar?
striking to me,
Oh, Harlan, yeah.
what's striking to me is that the seeming disconnect between heavenly voice cooing like a dove and what that dove is saying is not dove-like.
Well, what kind of associations do you have with the dove? Or do you bring with you for the dove into this story?
I think of the dove and Noah, and I think of the dove, and I don't know when the dove in history and ancient history, if it is, becomes some kind of symbol of peacefulness and purity and gentleness.
But there's also, Carla, the term, oops, there's also the term mourning dove.
Yeah,
M-O-U-R.
yeah,
There's different
M-O-U-R.
kinds of dove. So,
Yeah, yeah, right. It's also associated with the sounds of mourning. Gentle, to be sure, plaintive, but mourning.
Dove is a messenger?
Yeah, dove is a messenger. Yeah.
I also wonder if that's a sound that you would only hear in the ruin, and that the ruin is like what came down, what what was destroyed, and it's like the voices of the children or the people who were affected by the coming down of the house and the temple are speaking through that ruin, speaking through the stones. And maybe you wouldn't hear that if you weren't inside.
Maybe you wouldn't hear it. Maybe he would have sacrificed these ancient sounds or these not so ancient sounds. Again, he lives just after the destruction, or he's in Jerusalem just after the destruction of the temple. Maybe he wouldn't, maybe he purposely goes in there because that's what he's after. And he
Mm.
knows what the risks are and he's willing to take them. He's been part of the discussion, let's imagine, and he knows how his colleagues feel about it. And therefore, he's probably not surprised that Elijah comes and confirms and validates this. But then Elijah turns around and says to him this extraordinary thing, which almost doubles back on Elijah's affect and his intent and his caretaking. Well, okay, you shouldn't have been there, but as long as you were there, tell me, what did you hear while you were there? Elijah himself wants to know. What did you hear as long as you were there in the ruins? Standing there in the ruins, were you ought not have been?
It's almost like he needed to be in the ruins to hear that. If he were out on the road praying,
Well, that's what Sue was saying. The
that like
traffic,
Sue was
yeah.
saying, you hear the traffic, you'd hear all those other noises. It's almost like, but he had to go in the ruin so that he could, these things could be reverberating in his head and hear things that would not be available to him, whether he really heard them or not, but he should have.
Yeah. Well, one thing that struck me was in asking, what sound did you hear in the ruin? Elijah's assumption that Rabbi Yossi must have heard something.
Right. Right. Now Rabbi Yossi has to figure out what he heard. So anyone who has had a teacher, a master, a mentor, somebody who's asked you a similar question, look at that diagnosis and tell me what you see that's unusual. Or tell me what you see, never mind what's unusual. Look at that painting, look at that pot. And tell me what you see. What goes through the mind of the disciple, of the apprentice? Well, there must be something there.
But
I
when
better-
a mentor,
Huh?
when a mentor does that, it's likely the mentor knows the answer
What?
to the question
Yeah,
that
or
the
has
mentor is
something.
asking, or has a good idea of what was going on. So does Elijah hear it also?
That's a good
Because
question.
he has supernatural hearing?
It's a good question. Yeah, it's a good question. Somebody else was starting to talk.
The Bat Kol is a parallel to Elijah. Both are ways that the rabbis have access to the thoughts and voice of God. And they do seem, I don't think they appear together too often in the same story, but here Elijah is the teacher, and this cooing daughter of the voice it gives a fairly stern rebuke, really, I think. It's rather harsh, and it's just interesting that Rabbi Yossi is blessed with getting these two voices. I think of God's thoughts almost simultaneously, and they're quite different.
Yeah. It's interesting that, thank you. You mentioned Bat Kol, which is the way the rabbis think about the divine voice in a world that doesn't have any more prophecy in it. There are no more prophets. So does that mean you were without the divine voice? No, it doesn't mean that, but it means that it is mediated as imagination, let's say, and inspiration rather than authority. So the divine voice is not a Sinai voice anymore. It's not a voice of God saying to Jeremiah something that radically realigns the halacha or the practice, because God has said it authoritatively to a prophet. He doesn't say it authoritatively in that way anymore, because that opens the door for other prophets from other faith traditions and from other cults of the early centuries. The rabbis are not really willing to do that. So what they have to do is they have to close the system, and they do. There are no more books that are admitted to the sacred canon anymore. everything that is learned has to now be learned from the context of the various books. So,
So
including the law.
the bat coal is like the still small voice that Elijah hears.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
Or is it a feminine voice? The cooing, is it more feminine, lighter, more airy?
Yeah, what's the quality of that voice? That's a really interesting question. If we were to make the movie version of it, how would we characterize that voice? When this heavenly dove coos, you have to take your cue, your cueing cue, from what the dove says, which is, "Woe to the children, on account of whose sins I destroyed my house and burned my temple and exiled them among the nations." Anger, frustration, acceptance, sadness, sad reality, the acceptance of sad reality. What does that voice actually sound like? And whose voice would you actually use if you had to choose some actor, actress to portray this voice? I wonder.
Well,
Yeah.
it's definitely a feminine voice. It is not only in that moment, we're told, that she cries so. So I'm assuming this is, the feminine word in the Hebrew as well. So, and also, aren't we told that there's Rachel who cries for her lost children
Yes.
as you pass?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
So in my movie version, it would be a wise mourning woman.
Yeah. Yeah. Very nice. Very nice. And that's that little phrase about Rachel mourning that comes from the prophets, which from Jeremiah, has that voice of Rachel echoing throughout time. Kol Brahma Nishma. Rachel Mevaka al Banea. A voice is heard echoing from a voice is heard in Ramah in the heights. It is Rachel weeping for her children. And Rachel is long buried, but Jeremiah hears, of course, the great matriarch whose voice somehow still in this world can be heard defending and comforting her children. A great hero. So this is what Elijah tells, excuse me, this is what Rabbi Yossi tells Elijah that he has heard in the ruins. Whether he would have heard it exactly that way had Elijah not asked him or prompted him, we don't know. It's a little, it's teasing and wonderful. Would he have even mentioned it? Well, now that you, Master, have asked me that question, I have to reassess the things that I heard while I was in there. Was it really the snap of a twig? Was it really a rustle? Was it really just a plain pedestrian, everyday, ordinary, everyday variety dove, cooing dove? No. That dove now, at least in Rabbi Yossi's mind, has been spun from the straw of the everyday into the gold of the insightful, almost miraculous, or indeed miraculous. And Rabbi Yossi says, "Wow, I hadn't thought about it before, but what I heard was the dove actually mourning." And now Elijah takes it farther. "By your life and breath," he said, "it is not only in that moment that she cries so, it is every day. 3 times a day that she coos like a dove. Woo, 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 to the children. And not only that, but whenever Israel enters its synagogues and study houses and recites the Kaddish, saying, Yehei Shemei Hagadol Nevorach, may the great may his great name be blessed. The Holy One shakes his head and says, happy is the king who is thus praised in his house. What a thing for the father who banished his children to hear. Woe to those children who are banished from their father's table.
Hmm.
And there the curtain comes down on the story.
Hmm.
What about God? Now the dove is no longer just the dove. The dove is woo, because the Hebrew is oi, oi, oi. And so the dove is woe is me, whoa, whoa, whoa. But then it takes on more of a human, superhuman voice and gets transposed into the key of language of disappointment and of anger and of recrimination and also self-recrimination. Ah, whoa, whoa, oi becomes oi. Happy is the king who is thus praised in his house. And then turning on a dime 180 degrees.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What a thing for a father who banished his children to hear. Woe to those children who are banished from their father's table. You getting any kind of mixed message there?
Oh, I was thinking, how can it be that the children who have been banished from the table are nonetheless seem to be praising the father?
Yeah. What a poignant scene.
It's almost as he was saying that regardless of what I did to you, you still worship me.
Right. Right.
You still stay faithful to me, regardless of whether I'm faithful to you.
Right. Right.
Well, look how it turns. It starts happy as the king, and then the focus is on father, and then the focus is on the children. So it's a constant diminution. It just, goes down the rungs.
Yeah. Yeah. All this shuttling back and forth.
Mhm.
And also from dove to divine voice, divine message, undisguised voice of God. Yeah. And then the range of emotions. God upset, God admiring, God angry.
But this is where it ends, right? This section ends here.
Yeah.
And so it ends on a very negative, tragic note. Woe to those children who are banished from their father's table.
Yeah. Yeah. Whose fault is it, therefore, that Jerusalem has been destroyed?
Well, in the previous paragraph, he blamed the children. Woe to the children on account of whose sins I destroyed.
Yeah. I did it and they made me do it.
It's their fault. It's their fault.
It's their fault. Yeah.
People always blame the Jews.
Uh-huh. Yeah. And there's something here about parents and children also, and accepting and receiving blame. It's your fault that I don't know how to take any responsibility. Yeah.
Another religion has the story of the prodigal son. This may be our story of the prodigal father who we still praise and we do not blame.
I think it depends how you read those last 3 lines too. And there's probably been a lot that's been written about those, but I could almost read into the last 2 lines sympathy for the children, like blame on the father. The father banished them. what a thing for the father who banished his children to hear their praise. So, it's like such a mixed feeling for the father or the king, and sympathy for them when it says, "Woe to those children who were banished."
Mhm. Yeah.
So does the king, the father, have ambivalence? Was that did I make the right decision? Did I make the right move here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Think about the implications of that. A God who lives with ambivalence.
It feels like there's a lot of reflexivity. And, I remember the Amakai poem, Rav, that you brought us that almost had like the Escher where the two hands are drawing each other.
Mhm.
And oh my God, these children, what have they done? Oh my God, who created these children? And how did I create them? And what is it that I created them that made them do this kind of thing?
Right. And then in response to what they did, what did I do?
That's right. So there's this continual reflexivity, not just
Yeah.
between parent and child, but between we make each other, and that's how the world unfolds.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, since I can, I looked on Safaria to a reference to an interpretation of Ibn Saprut that woe to the children because their pain also adds to the father's pain.
Mhm. Yeah, we can take this in a lot of dimensions that we've experienced or that we could intuit, with things that we would likely find actually articulated by medieval commentators who are drawn to these kinds of stories, where the skeleton is there ready to be clothed with a kind of emotion that, of course, we understand, because we're not going to just pick emotions out of the clear blue. We're going to pick emotions that reflect our own emotions and our own experiences. But what?
Yeah.
Yes, I am. We can. I think it's fair to say, as a couple have alluded, and some even used the word, that that ambivalence, a God who is ambivalent, is very present in this story. A God who can't quite, who gets it, who understands, and also gets and regrets what it means to destroy Jerusalem.
I wonder
Yeah.
I wonder who the destroyer actually was. I keep thinking of Avinu Malkeinu. There are these two. There's the God who is close to us, the Father, who was more intimate with us, and then there's the King. As on the high holy days, there are these two. There's a God that we can easily draw close to, and then there's the God who is somehow unreachable by us. And so I just think about that when I read this passage, that it's possible for the God who is more distant from us to be happy with our praise, while the one who wants to be close to us is suffering with us.
Mhm.
With us.
Yeah, a God who suffers. Is there a God is there a divine presence that is more august or more elevated than that, and one that's more imminent than that? And did they shuttle back and forth? And did Rabbi Yossi have to go into the ruins in order to discover that? And by the way, when he begins, not by the way at all, it's actually quite to the point. Rabbi Yossi said, once I was traveling and I entered one of the ruins of Jerusalem to pray. What kind of image does that open up to you? What does that sound like? A ruin of Jerusalem. The whole city is ruins, to be sure, but does it conjure up any, if you had to locate this,
Old city.
what we would call now the old city?
Temple.
The what?
The temple.
The temple? Yeah. One of the Churbot Yerushalayim. And the destroyed temple is often called Khurban. And Khurban Habayit, the destruction of the temple, is a prominent phrase in the language of these sages. So is this ruin where he is praying actually in some ways a stand-in for the temple itself, even if it's not the temple itself, although it could well be? Is it at least a stand-in for the temple? And from within this temple, well, he goes in there for some purpose. And the purpose is not to just be in the face of those who say you shouldn't go into the ruins. I'm just assuming that Rabbi Yossi knows the arguments on this side and that, and probably agrees with them, and probably wears his seatbelt at every opportunity, and takes good care of himself in all of those kinds of ways that make our physicians happy with us. But he's gonna brave it all to go into this ruin, because he's got to come to terms with something, and he's got to pray inside that ruin. And then along comes Eliyahu Hanavi and waits for him. V'himtin li al hapetach, the text says. He waited for me on the doorstep. Ad shesiyamti et tfilati, until I finished my prayer. And then he said, tell me what you're doing here. And gave him all these reasons why he shouldn't be there. And then said, by the way, as long as you were there anyway, you shouldn't have been in that ruin, but since you were, what did you learn there? What did you hear? Prompting Rabbi Yossi to perhaps transpose whatever sounds he heard there that might just have been accounted for as being the natural signs of life coming back to the chinks and crevices of those rocks. Or maybe it was something more than that. And it turns out that what Elijah prompts him to hear is this huge echo chamber of grief and of loyalty and of exhilaration. And even if this is not the temple, it represents the act of prayer in the temple or prayer houses. Elijah says, by the hair of your chinny chin chin, she cries this way 3 times a day, Shacharit, Mincha, and Mariv. Every time there's a minyan someplace. And people go in and stand up in the presence of their disappointment and their tears. In the presence of all of that that is represented by the destruction of Jerusalem, in the shadowy presence, the threatening presence of a God who chose to destroy Jerusalem despite what they thought was the talismanic power of the temple. All destroyed, all gone. Who did this? And they hear reflected in their own anger and their own disappointment and their own surprise at the turn of history that God also is ambivalent and disappointed and surprised, not only in the divine self, but also in them. And that whenever there's prayer that's going on, it brings God back to that place, as it were, the place that is represented by this ruin, which represents the temple. And they do go in, and they do pray, and they do study. And then they make their declaration of loyalty. May his great name be blessed. Yehei Shemei Hagadol Mevorach. May his great name be blessed. The Blessed Holy One shakes his head then and says, Ashrei HaMelech. Happy is the king who is thus praised in his house, which means both the synagogue as it exists and also the temple as it existed.
It also means the ruins as they exist, because essentially what he's saying is, even though you have destroyed Jerusalem, my presence is still here. Your presence is still there.
Yeah.
You have exiled us, but you are still there.
Yeah. What a lesson to learn and then to teach. I wonder, is it worth going into the ruins to encounter that? Of course, maybe you need Elijah. Did he go into the ruins in order not only to pray? He's not a one-man minion. He didn't say Kaddish or anything like that. But is this also part of his mourning and his deep reflection on what it means to stand among the ashes and the sulfur and the rubble of Jerusalem, where the limestone blocks perhaps are still too hot to touch. Is that what this is about? Jerusalem in this ruin, and being the great echo chamber of ear and soul and spirit, that he needs to put himself in touch with that. He needs to cry over it. And crying over it in the middle of I-95 or off on the rest stop is not, is not what he needs. Might be safer, but very, you should excuse me, pedestrian. And not allowing him to be where he needs to be. So it becomes a question, I suppose, for all of us. I don't want to get sermonic about it, but I think it's interesting. When do you risk the ruin? Yeah.
I think the point is not, for me, my interpretation, the point is not so much the ruin as it is the presence. That if the need to pray, the need to recognize takes place anywhere, and that there's no place here that it says you can't pray in the ruins. But why go someplace else? Be present where you are, and that my presence is always there, your presence is always there, and that the connection exists all the time, that no matter where you are.
And it goes back to what we talked about, I think it was last time, with Hamakom, the place, the God, and what Stacy was saying, the presence, your presence wherever it is where Hamakom is. That is where the place is where God is.
Yeah, that's the place where this mourning and reflection takes place. Yeah, quite right. But,
right,
yeah.
right. Not geographical.
Mhm.
It's not geographical. It's an emotional presence.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Jane,
Jane, yeah.
you're muted.
There's this prohibition of going into a ruin, but if a person goes into a ruin, it's not a deserted ruin. In other words, the presence of a human figure praying within a ruin is bringing life into that ruin. Why is there the prohibition?
Uh-huh.
It could be partially, it could be mourning that this is Jerusalem this is the temple that was, but the fact that somebody is remembering it and comes to it, into it to pray is hopeful.
Yeah, you could certainly look at it that way, and maybe it does become that over a period of time. Maybe this is so close to the destruction of the temple that their concern really is further falling rocks and all of the other things that nasty things that could happen in the ruin, and it really is a matter of defending the self. And that maybe that would change after a while as Jerusalem starts to get rebuilt, and one starts to have faith that these rebuilt walls will actually hold you. But that time is not now. And so here's a prayer, Rabbi Yossi, who by the end of the story, we want to walk back to the beginning of the story and apply to him some kind of motive. All right, I know I need to find something in that ruin, and I know what the rules are, but I'm going into that ruin and I'm not really sure what I'm going to find there. But I know I need to be surrounded by those ruined walls. And then Elijah comes and helps him, waits for him on the doorstep, on the threshold, until he finishes his prayer, getting as deep as he can into that prayer himself, safeguarded by the prophet, until such moment as Elijah can say to him, okay, what were you doing here? Why were you here? And by the way, while you were there, tell me what you learned. And so the story goes for us. Yeah, Harlan.
what are we to do with this in our prayer if it says every time you go to the synagogue and recite Kaddish? That's not a time-bound statement. What do we do when we say Kaddish now? Is this supposed to be some kind of archaic vestige of all the things that course through our heart and our mind and our soul as we're saying that?
Yeah, how far back do we take that investment in reciting the Kaddish? Is it a loyalty statement to the way, to community and the way it unfolds? Is it a loyalty statement to a God who is a supernatural power, or a loyalty statement to a God who is the impulse of creativity and constancy and continuity in the Jewish tradition? How do we imagine that God, if we could personify God, what would God do? Say, oh, this is so delicious and it also hurts so much, all at the same time. Is that what we would hope that God would do, and account to us the merit that comes from being constant and faithful in this kind of way? Yeah, I love where this is actually taking us. There's a short story by Shai Agnon, called The Fable of the Goat, Maase Ha'ez, which ends really with this same declaration. Woe to the father who has done this to his children. Woe to the children who have made his father do it. And not talking about the temple, but still echoing with what the temple means. And well, yeah, there are doorways involved in that story too. So I'm just trying to think of how far we go in posting things that people might want to read. It's not a long story. It's a very short story.
Some of us have read it with you
Yeah,
at the Shabbaton.
it's a very short story that we could probably just post. And if you're interested in it, you can make the parallels. You can make the jump from the Talmud story to the other. There is a cave that has a door, and from the time one enters the door till the time one leaves the next door, one is caught up in some kind of timeless, spaceless vortex. And then on the other side, you're in the land of Israel, and the question is, can you come and go? Or a question is, can you come and go as you want? And the answer lies in the story, which you'll have to read. Anyway, I think that we've gotten to the end of our hour, so I'll leave you with this other story that has so much to do with Elijah as being the liminal presence. He's there just on the limen, which is to say, in Latin, just on the threshold, and he can ask you the question of what you saw. He can be, as Adina said a couple of weeks ago, he can be directive in a certain way. He can redirect things without actually telling you, giving you an answer, but allowing you to find an answer. So if that's the Elijah that we would love to meet at Pesach time, I invite you to invite him, or see that Elijah who comes to the door. We have another time before Pesach, I guess. Yeah.
I think so. The Monday night before.
Yeah. So another visit with Elijah before he knocks on our door, or before we anticipate him and open the door on our own accord, and invite him in. All right. But for now, let's put a bookmark in the conversation and we will pick it up again.
Joshua Koach.
Baruch Tiyeh. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank